Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. Today we're going to focus upon nuclear weapons and the imminent threat that they really have against people all around the world. My guest today is someone who's very familiar with this issue and what can be done to reduce this nuclear threat. My guest today is Jonathan Granoff. Mr. Jonathan Granoff is the current president of the Global Security Institute. Mr. Jonathan Granoff, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Thank you, Bill. It's an honor to be here.
I appreciate you being back with me. We did this about 4 or 5 years ago, and the threat is still there, so we're going to have to work on that.
Absolutely.
Jonathan, we will. Let's talk about the Global Security Institute for a moment. What exactly is it? When was it formed? What is your mission?
Our mission is to reduce the threat of nuclear weapons by using the rule of law and global cooperation. Most of the diplomats have a perspective. In fact, all of the diplomats have a perspective that they have to represent their nation. Well, I'm an American patriot, but I think there are some issues that are global in nature. So the civil society advocates at the United Nations are able to advocate for the whole planet. And there's a lot of issues like that. So we've picked an issue that we think is, well, if you solve every other issue, climate, pandemic diseases, cybersecurity, sustainable development, and you don't solve the threat of nuclear weapons, it really won't matter. So my board includes people like Mikhail Gorbachev, Nobel Peace Laureate President Oscar Arias, 2 former Undersecretary Generals, Jane Goodall, really eminent advisors who see this as Robert Kennedy told me when I was a young man interning in Washington, and when he described the Cuban Missile Crisis, the moral and practical litmus test of our time. So we have an organization with about 800 parliamentarians in one of our programs, Parliamentarians for Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament, the bipartisan security group of eminent former diplomats and experts in Washington of Republican and Democrats. And of course, we do a lot of work here at the United Nations, which is sort of the brain trust of the world, a place where everybody comes together and where treaties are created. And we need treaties to protect us from this ever-growing threat.
Exactly. And if our viewers would like more information on the Global Security Institute, they can go to gsinstitute.org and get a lot more information on what we're talking about today. I'm glad you brought up some of the names of the people you did, like Dr. Jane Goodall, who's been on our program, and several of the other people you've been involved with over the years. Now, we keep hearing from time to time, not as much as we need to, about the threat of nuclear weapons, how there's a chance of an accidental nuclear exchange, or maybe even a purposeful one. Think back to when Dr. Albert Einstein referenced how if World War III were fought with nuclear weapons. He said, I don't know what maybe World War III would be fought with, but World War IV would be fought with sticks and stones. Was he accurate on that?
In fact, it was his conversation with Senator Alan Cranston, who was the founder of the Global Security Institute, that put Senator Cranston on this issue, because indeed he was very accurate. And he said that nuclear weapons must change our thinking about everything, or we slide toward destruction. He also pointed out that the only tool we have to constrain the behavior of states is law. Well, I would disagree with him to some extent. I think we also have law and morality. Nuclear weapons are both, there's a duty to get rid of them under the law, under international law, by treaty and the unanimous ruling of the International Court of Justice. And I think there's a moral imperative to get rid of them. I'm very pleased to share that this past General Assembly, there was a General Assembly resolution on the ethical imperative to eliminate nuclear weapons that a majority of nations in the world called for. So it's both a moral, a practical, and a legal necessity. And Albert Einstein was absolutely right.
And one of the mechanisms that's in place right now, you alluded to it, was the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. We'll just call it the NPT. Just a little overview. What is the NPT? When was it established? And what could it do? What should it do? And what is it doing?
Well, there's a lot in there you've asked, but
we'd only spend 5 on that one.
Sure, sure. Well, it's the third most important legal instrument of the 20th century. I think the first is the United Nations Charter, which creates the United Nations. The second is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that sets forth the standards of ethical conduct toward one another, inherent human dignity of the individual that must be protected. And the third is the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. After the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Central Intelligence Agency and the KGB of the Soviet Union looked at the situation, how close we came to ending civilization. And they concluded that absent some constraint, there would be dozens of nuclear weapon states. And another crisis like this could end civilization. So they began negotiating a treaty that would stop the proliferation of nuclear weapons. However, it contained within it a promise that the states with nuclear weapons, the 5 states that had tested nuclear weapons prior to January 1967, the United States, the United Kingdom, Russia, China, and France, the P5 as it is in the Security Council, that they promised to negotiate the elimination of their nuclear weapons. That was part of the quid pro quo. Countries said, well, if we're going to forego it forever, we must have negotiations to eliminate them. Also contained in it was the promise that if you did not develop nuclear weapons, that you'd have peaceful uses of nuclear technology. So today, every country in the world except for North Korea, India, Pakistan, and Israel are members of this treaty. It's almost universal. And the treaty contains within it a promise to negotiate the elimination of weapons. It came into force while Richard Nixon was President of the United States. He was a strong supporter of it, and that's why we have it. And until very recently, there was, at least in the United States, bipartisan support for this treaty and fulfilling its commitment. We must get back to that because every human being on the planet is threatened by this technology. As one ambassador here called it, the apex of human ingenuity in the service of destruction.
Which aptly sums it up. What can we do to get, what can the UN do? I know the UN, as you mentioned, is the meeting hall of the world. It really brings all of the countries, all 193 countries of the world together under one roof to deal with these problems. But we see that Articles 4 and 6 of the Non-Proliferation Treaty have not been abided by, that the nuclear powers are not reducing. I guess they are reducing to some degree.
Oh, they've reduced enormously.
But not to where they should be, I guess.
Well, where they should be, I mean, well, let's say what Article 4 and Article 6 are, okay. Article 4 ensures the peaceful uses of nuclear technology. So I would say that in some has been adhered to, that nuclear technology has spread, for good or ill. I mean, we can't deny Chernobyl and Fukushima, that it may not be wise to develop nuclear energy plants, but it's certainly legal. And Article 6 contains the promise of negotiating in good faith the elimination of nuclear weapons under strict international controls. So the nuclear weapon states highlight, particularly the United States and Russia, which have 96% of the weapons, they highlight how we've gone from well over 60,000, we're now down to about 15,000 weapons. So that's a huge reduction quantitatively. But we still have far too many. Each of us has over 1,500 ready to completely annihilate civilization. What we found out now, interestingly, is climate research has really increased in recent decades, and our computer ability to simulate the consequences of nuclear weapons has advanced considerably. So the best experts give an opinion that under certain circumstances of weather and so forth, and particular cities, but they opine that as little as less than 1% of the arsenal exchange, like an exchange between Pakistan and India, on cities would throw at least 5 tons of soot into the stratosphere. And that would so adversely impact the climate of the planet by creating a nuclear winter, as it were, that agriculture, as we know it, would be destroyed. Billions of people would starve, and civilization as we know it would be destroyed. And if that escalated into a full exchange, say, between Russia and the United States, not only would civilization be destroyed, but almost certainly human life itself would be destroyed.
Exactly. And even though there are only 15,000 nuclear weapons, the firepower is so intense that if there was some type of nuclear exchange, be it in Europe or between North Korea and South Korea or whatever, it literally, as you mentioned, could wipe out living organisms, or certainly debilitate.
Well, North Korea doesn't have nearly enough to do that, but the point that you're making is well taken. Let's get an idea what we're talking about. we have some idea of the visuals of Hiroshima, just the absolute leveling of the city, you know. And that was about the equivalent of 15,000 tons of TNT. We have bombs in the megaton or million-ton range now. That's 70 Hiroshimas. The Soviets actually tested a weapon that was 50 megatons. That would be the equivalent of about 3,000 Hiroshimas. It is clear that the human mind is incapable of conceiving of this kind of destruction and the suffering that it would create. A mere handful of them would clearly rip to shreds and throw humanity into a state of shock beyond the amount of destruction that they have. If there were one nuclear bomb that a sub-state actor got a hold of, you know, a very primitive bomb, the size of Hiroshima or Nagasaki, and exploded it in any city, that city would be destroyed. And imagine if that happened, say, in Washington or London or Moscow. The very presumptions we have of civilized society would collapse, I believe. People would go into panic. Our stock markets would crash. Imagine if a sub-state actor, a terrorist, for example, got a hold of this much nuclear material and were to explode a nuclear bomb in a city, and they were then to go public and say, we have 5 more of them in 5 other cities, and this is what we want. What would the consequences of that be? We can't allow that to happen. And every country in the world, every leader of state has an obligation to every citizen to make sure that that doesn't happen. So what people like myself are doing is saying, you have to grow up and live up to this obligation. In the same way as you have to protect the climate, you have to protect the oceans. You know, 50% of our oxygen comes from phytoplankton, the plankton on the oceans. It's our third lung. Our leaders have to protect that. Now, how will they cooperate to protect the oceans, the climate, the rainforest, another 30% of our oxygen, while they're pointing nuclear weapons at one another? I think it's absurd. It's absurd that we would do that when everybody knows that we are one human family. Every child knows that. Are the people is there anybody in the United States that you know that would like to wipe out the people of Russia? And I've been to Russia several times. I assure you that at least the young people in Russia, who they like the United States. They like us. So why are we doing this? How did we get in this trap? This is the question of our time.
Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is a privately funded, independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guests. We would invite our viewers to go to our website at www.globalconnectionstelevision.com to view previous programs. Also, if you are involved with any type of media outlet, be it a PBS or community access television station, or perhaps an educational institution that has an intra-campus hookup, or you just have a website and you'd like to share our programs, please feel free to do so. Global Connections Television is provided free of charge as a public service to help people better understand international issues and how they impact us. Today we're taking a look at the potential threat of nuclear weapons, and my guest today is an expert on this topic. My guest today is Mr. Jonathan Granoff. Jonathan Granoff is the president of the Global Security Institute. Jonathan, we're talking about these nuclear weapons, and as you mentioned, the intensity today of them, the power is just overwhelming. It's just unbelievable. As I think back to 1945 with Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and we used the atomic weapons, there have been since then, at least to my knowledge, and you probably know more about this than I'm sure you do, there have been at least 12 reported incidents of where there could have been an accidental exchange.
Oh, yeah.
Whereas computers, for example, our computer in the United States showed that the former Soviet Union had set off missiles. They showed that we had set them off. They were all false blips. How prevalent is that problem, and how does that really reinforces why we really need to get serious about reducing this nuclear stockpile so that we don't have not only a purposeful suitcase floating down the Hudson River with a nuclear weapon, but also some type of accidental exchange?
Human beings are fallible, and anything we create is only going to be as good as we are. It's just that simple. So there was a weather satellite that got launched off the coast of Norway while Boris Yeltsin was president, and relations between Russia and the United States were excellent. For a while, for a few minutes, it looked like it was a Trident launch that was going to hit Moscow and have an electromagnetic pulse and fry the electrical systems of Russia. Boris Yeltsin only had a few minutes to decide what to do. It turned out it was a weather satellite. The Norwegians had told the Russians it wasn't passed up the command and control. The reason that he didn't launch under the threat was that he said that he didn't believe Bill Clinton would do that. We weren't in a state of crisis. We weren't in a state of tension. And during the height of the Cold War, when we were in a state of tension, right after the Korean airliner had been shot down by the Soviets, there was a man who saved the world. Colonel Stanislav Petrov is his name. All of us are beholden to this colonel. The Soviet computers all showed a full-scale American launch. And he didn't pass the message up the command and control because he knew that if he did, they would have quickly launched 11,000 nuclear weapons at the United States. And when we saw those, we would have launched ours. Everything would have ended. Every human being that we know today would not be here today. He violated his protocols. He saved the world. It was the way the sun hit a strange configuration of clouds. When Bill Perry was Secretary of Defense, there was an instance in which somebody he told me, we did an interview with the American Bar Association. He told me there was an instance in which a training tape was played and it looked like a full-scale Soviet launch. We only have a few minutes to decide. Ronald Reagan said, 6 minutes to decide the fate of humanity is insane. That's why one of the reasons why he was such a strong advocate for nuclear disarmament. Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev almost got us over the hump. We got this close to getting rid of this threat. So it's not only the danger that they pose. Now, the people who advocate for them say they bring security, they bring stability. I say, let's look at this rationally. Imagine if the Biological Weapons Convention said no country can use polio or smallpox as a weapon, but we'll let 9 countries use the plague as a weapon for international security. We would say that's obviously not stable. It's not fair. It's not just. And if 9 countries say this is good for us, others will surely say it's good for them. You can't say it's good for me and it's not good for you. That doesn't fly. So the choice before us today is either the inevitable accident or design of the use, the inevitable spread if we don't stop it, or a clear commitment of every political leader on the planet to find ways to get rid of them. And there are ways. We know the pathway. The diplomats here at the UN have laid out 13 steps that would move us in that direction. Stopping nuclear testing, cutting off the production of nuclear materials, strengthening the inspection regime. There's negotiations that are taking place at the United Nations that possibly when this show is shown, we will have it, a treaty prohibiting nuclear weapons that over 100 countries will certainly sign on to that as a step in that direction to degrade these weapons from being something of status to being something of what they really are, something of abhorrence.
If there is an international system of monitoring this really scaling down of these nuclear weapons, can it work? That's what people ask. They say, well, how can we trust country X? How can they trust country Y if they start to reduce their nuclear stockpile? Is there, I know there's not a fail-safe, foolproof system any place in the world, but if all the countries of the world came together to work on this and to really apply themselves to it, would this system work to make sure that one country didn't cheat on it?
Well, the amount of money that the International Atomic Energy Agency spends on inspections is minuscule to the amount of money we spend in building the arsenals. We have to change that equation. Nuclear weapons leave a footprint. It's not the weapon that you need to monitor, it's the nuclear material. And yes, it can be monitored because it's trackable. But it's deeper than that. I mean, nuclear weapons are a 1940s technology with a 1930s physics. And physics and technology have advanced considerably. On the shelf are all kinds of horrific weapons that have not been put out. So we have to put in place an order of security in which mutual trust, cooperation, and identification of shared interests is part of our common normative behavior. And getting rid of nuclear weapons which threaten everybody is part of that process. We can't wait for that to be put in order. part of the process of getting to realizing the need to cooperate to protect the climate, to protect against pandemic diseases, is working together to get rid of nuclear weapons. And part of that is an inspection regime that's more vigorous. But it's very good, actually. I mean, the International Atomic Energy Agency, when Saddam Hussein cheated, Hans Blix's people caught him and stopped the program. People forget that the UN system, the reason why Iraq did not have weapons of mass destruction was because the UN system worked.
It certainly did, and we see it right now with the Iranian nuclear deal that was cracked, I guess, 2015, I believe it was the year that came online. That is actually a very, very monumental agreement that Iran is abiding by, plus all the other parties are abiding by, that has reduced the possibility of having some type of, first off, a war against Iran, which was the next step. That was what people were talking about, but also the fact of Iran going nuclear. But it has proven that the system can work.
Well, more importantly, it's not a deal.
It's not a deal?
No, it's a Security Council resolution.
Oh, okay.
So a deal is something you can renegotiate, and but when the Security Council passes a resolution, it's international law. So the obligations that Iran has are obligations not to the United States or just the other parties, it's to the whole world. And the obligations of the United States and France and the other parties that negotiated the arrangement are to the world. So it's a universal deal by virtue of it being a Security Council resolution. So we talk of it as a deal, but that's actually not really accurate. It's more than a deal now. It is.
It's gone beyond the deal
It's gone beyond a deal.
It certainly is.
And so to discuss like backing out of it and so forth is very, very irresponsible. Do you see what I mean?
Exactly. Understood. This whole situation, there are so many other points I would like to discuss, but we're about to run out of time on this. But when I think about, I have a statistic from a few years ago that it costs just the United States government alone like $125 million a day to maintain the nuclear stockpile. That's not building a new one. That's maintaining it, not retrofitting it or whatever. Now we hear that some of the countries like the US, Russia, and some others want to upgrade their nuclear arsenals. And just the figures you hear in the United States, like $1 trillion or more, to create these weapons that will provide more instability, will they not? Is this not an opportune time for us to reduce those stockpiles?
Well, their argument is if we modernize, we can reduce the size. But the point of the matter is that nuclear weapons are a paradox. If the goal is security, the paradox is the more you perfect the weapon, the less security you obtain. So it's an improved means to an unimproved end. But I think even though the trillions of dollars, enormous amounts of money have been spent, and if it brought security, I'd say let's spend it. But the point of the matter is now the opportunity cost is higher than the economic cost. The opportunity cost is the failure to identify our shared cooperative interests. You realize in the war in the Balkans, just 20 years ago, United States and Russian troops fought together under one command. So we're not enemies, but we're putting each other and the whole planet at risk. And there is no military solution to the tension between India and Pakistan. There's no military solution to North Korea. These weapons put the whole world in a hazard incommensurate with any gain they could possibly give us. That's why I would urge every single person watching this show, they don't have to become experts. They should demand of their political leaders, what are your plans to fulfill the legal obligation of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty to negotiate elimination? What are your plans to fulfill the unanimous decision of the International Court of Justice to negotiate the elimination of nuclear weapons? What are your plans to make us safer from this threat? And demand that our political leaders put this front and center and say to them, we're going to vote on, this matters to us. We're going to vote on this issue. Because this issue affects every single person on the planet. And our political leaders need to learn about it. They need to be educated about it. The other day here at the UN, Richard Lugar, the Republican senator from the Midwest, talked about how he learned about the issue and how much good he did in building bridges with the Russians.
Exactly, and he now works with a think tank that's working in this direction. But Jonathan Granoff, this is such a vital issue. It is one that affects everybody on the planet, and there is no escaping it if we were to have some type of nuclear exchange. So we all have to work together to make sure that we never have it. But I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and very informative program.
Could I end with one comment?
Quickly.
Senator Cranston said, "It puts the planet Earth at risk, and this may be the only place in the universe where love is found."
Great way to end it. Thank you. I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us today on Global Connections program.